Hey y'all, it's Heel Heat time.
Hi everybody and welcome to Heel Heat. My name is George Coles and on this episode, we're going to go with a suggestion from one of our friends. From our friend Ryan Hadley, who's mentioned in comments that he'd like to see us review it. We're going to review, quite possibly, the worst wrestling pay-per-view of all time, Heroes of Wrestling from 1999. Let's jump right into it. Nowhere to start but to go into a little bit of a backstory. 99, as you may know, is at the peak of the Attitude Era. WCW was still going somewhat strong. ECW was still around doing... Actually, ECW was getting bigger than they ever were. Their money problems wasn't because of their size. There was a huge boom in wrestling. 11 million people were watching wrestling every Monday night, whether it be WWE or WCW. There were companies all over the world trying to piggyback off that success. There were companies popping up all over the place trying to get their foot in the door, get their money, and lo and behold, Heroes of Wrestling. A show that decided that they were to go out and get some of the guys that were mostly famous in the 80s and early 90s and bring them in as kind of, because they still had name value at this point. They still do at this time, but we're way past their value in the ring. And that, as you'll see as we get on the card, we were at that time as well. They brought them in kind of to do a nostalgia / was going to be a ongoing pay-per-view show or pay-per-view specials where they were going to keep going on and do these. I believe it was quarterly was the idea. Kind of like an old-timers game that you would see at at baseball or a Legends game, something of that nature. That being said, we gave a little backstory. Now let's jump right into the show. Now, for this show, we're going to do a rating system on the whole show at 1 to 5 overall. And also, every match we're going to give ratings to. 1 to 5 scale, 1 being the worst, 5 being the best. As you're going to see, there may be some things on here that don't fit on the scale. Just a precursor. Ryan, this one's for you, man. Jumping right in. Samoan SWAT team versus Marty Jannetty and Tommy Rogers. The Samoan SWAT team is Samu and Fatu. They say it's Fatu, but at the time Fatu was being Rikishi on WWE TV. It's actually the Tonga Kid that's playing Fatu. Both of these guys were bigger than they had been in years, out of shape a bit. And Marty and Tommy Rogers actually were in great shape. And believe it or not, I think at this time they still could have made a big impact and still could have been a solid team. Both of them were really good wrestlers. Marty Jannetty, obviously part of the Rockers. Tommy Rogers, part of the Fantastics. I thought believe it or not, if you look at this and you look at some of their other matches at the time, these guys were still close to their prime. Probably closer than most of the people on this list, to be honest with you. But overall, Samoan SWAT team picks up the win. Kind of a lackluster match. Starts the show off slow. We'll give this one a 1 out of 5. Now next up, we have Greg the Hammer Valentine versus George the Animal Steele. For some strange reason, George the Animal Steele is being managed by sensational Sherry Martel. I don't get it. They show some backstage with them going to dinner and going to a hotel. Weirdness. We find out during the match as Sherry helps Valentine win. After the match, Steele gets his comeuppance. George Steele had been wrestling since the 60s, so basically 30 years at this point. And he was not good. And Valentine was in bad shape as well. This was where we first see it really going off the rails. The first match was bad, but it wasn't at the level that this match was bad. Just two guys that probably should have kept it hung up and not done the show. Maybe done some autograph signings or other things. And we'll talk about, when I get through everything, my ideas of how they could have made it better, made the show better. But I'm going to give this one a negative one. The first time we've ever started to go into the negative scale on rating things. Next up, we have the match that probably should have been the match of the night. Julio Fantastico, who would go on later to be Julio De Niro, versus Too Cold Scorpio. I don't know what it was. Both these guys actually were in the prime of their careers here. Too Cold a little heavy, but he always carried a little bit extra weight around this time. It didn't preclude him from being a fantastic wrestler. He was coming off his Flash Funk run. So this actually should have been a really good match. I don't know why it wasn't. Too Cold picks up the win. They just didn't click with each other. It should have been better than it was. I'll give the match a 1. It wasn't as bad as the match before, but nowhere near as good as it should have been. I thought, looking at the card, I thought, again, this is the first time I've watched this in its entirety. I've seen pieces of this show, but I wanted to watch it all as one complete show. And I thought, looking at it on paper, this was going to be the best match. Unfortunately, it may have been, but that's not saying much for the card itself. We'll give it a 1 out of 5, which leads us into our next match of the night. Nikolai, Volkoff, and the Iron Sheik versus the Bushwhackers, who are called the Men from Down Under, I guess for legal reasons. Volkoff and Sheik were very slow. If you watched the gimmick battle royal from WrestleMania 17 and watched how Sheik was wrestling in that match, times that by 2, and you have their tag team. Bushwhackers were a little bit better. They were more similar to their Bushwhacker run, nowhere near as good as they were during their Sheep Herder run. But the match was terrible. This was, if I were to say the 5 worst wrestling matches that I've personally seen, this match makes the list. And it was bad. The Bushwhackers pick up the win. We're giving this match a -5 on that 1 to 5 scale. Again, this is the first time we're going into negatives, so just not a good match at all, in my opinion. Next up, we have another match that on paper I thought was going to be good. It actually wasn't too bad. Sweet Stan Lien from the Midnight Express versus Tully Blanchard of the Four Horsemen. I believe at this point Tully had been retired for 6 or 7 years and only did bookings here and there. Stan Lien, I believe, had been retired for 2 or 3 years as well. Believe it or not, they didn't come off as bad as it could have been. It was a passable match, and it's made to felt worse by how bad the card is itself, but this wasn't that bad. It was probably, Tully picks up the win. I'm going to give the match a 1 out of 5. It wasn't as bad as some of the dribble on the rest of the show, but again, like Julio Fantastico and Too Cold, it didn't quite live up to the hype. To me, Tully Blanchard's one of my favorite of all time. I loved his work. It just felt like they were moving in slow motion. And it's because they're all advanced in age, and that's why we have this show like this. Next up, we have Abdullah the Butcher versus a one-man gang in a hardcore style match. This one, watching this in 2018, is striking because of how bloody both men got. You don't really see that much outside of CZW and deathmatch wrestling now. But there was a time, even as late as this and even a little bit later, that it was the norm for both guys to be, there'd be a match on the card where both guys were bleeding buckets of blood. This was a nice, okay, hardcore brawl. Knowing Abdullah the Butcher and being a fan of Abdullah the Butchers and being a fan of one-man gangs, I knew what I was getting into with this, so I was okay with what we had. This wasn't their worst matches, either one of them, and it wasn't their best matches, either one of them. It was good. I like the hardcore aspect. I like them trying to bring it in and have at least one match, considering the Attitude Era was doing it. They had a hardcore championship. ECW was as hot as it ever is going to be. So, I like that a little bit. They both end up brawling into the back, which leads us to a no contest. Striking now because of the bloodbath aspect, but for the time, it was what was happening in wrestling. I'm going to give this match a 1 out of 5. It was probably better than it deserved to be, and if the card wasn't so bad, I probably, at this point, we're 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 matches in, and I've been underwhelmed the whole night, so maybe watching this separate from the show, or having this be an opener on a different show, I would have thought more highly of it, but with the surroundings and the environment, I give it a 1, in my opinion. Next up, we have Jimmy Superfly Snuka versus Cowboy Bob Orton. As a running theme through the night, these are two guys that were heavily involved in the first WrestleMania, which at this point was 14 years earlier. The first WrestleMania, Snuka had already been wrestling almost 20 years. So we're 25 plus years into his career. Orton, I think, is 20 plus years into his career. Bob Orton Jr., this is Randy's dad. So, and we're still a few years off from Randy debuting. There's 3 years. This is 3 years before we get Randy Orton. So the running theme is that this was two guys that are way past their prime. The match felt like you were watching it in slow motion. Snuka picks up the win, as it seems to be through most of the night. The faces seem to be getting over pretty good on the card, giving the fans something, good nostalgia. So it wasn't the worst match yet, but again, if I did a top 10 worst matches of all time, this probably falls in there. I'm going to give it a -2 on the scale. So far we've had a -1, and a -5, and a -2. Next up, we had one of two build main events. Jim the Anvil Neidhart versus Jake the Snake Roberts. I say build main events because we start this match. We get the infamous promo that Jake the Snake Roberts, if you got 21, I got 22. Everybody's seen it. Everybody knows it. Jake comes to the ring either so drunk or so high or such a combination of both that it's unbearable to watch almost. It's disturbing that they let him go to the ring in that capacity. And I've seen a lot of things where they've let Jake from this era, even on, later on, go out to the ring in shapes like this. I don't know why bookers allowed this. This is the exact reason why you put on their card subject to change. This made Jeff Hardy versus Sting look like Okada versus Omega. That's how bad off, drugged up, or drunk, or whatever combination Jake was. He did a lot of weird things, like pretending the snake was his penis. The booker of the show comes out. They call him Little King Kong Bundy. You can see he calls an audible on the fly. And we turn this match, and what should have been the other main event, into a tag team match. So we have Jim the Anvil Neidhart and King Kong Bundy, who came out to try and save the match, going up against Jake the Snake Roberts and Yokozuna. Now, at this point, Yoko was probably close to 700 pounds, maybe even more than that. Well bigger than he was just a few years ago, and I believe that Yokozuna died within 2 years of this, and I really hate that he did because I loved Yoko. I liked the character in WWE. I wish he would have got some of it under control and could have been here still. It's a real shame that he passed away early because he was a supremely talented, huge guy and a great wrestler. Jake as well. Jake's demons derailed him. He was supremely talented. King Kong Bundy, very underrated in history, also another great big guy. And Jim Neidhart, kind of the glue of the Hart Foundation, a good solid wrestler, never was going to be a star, but he was good at any position you put him in. You could put him anywhere on the card and he was going to be good. So Neidhart and Bundy up against Jake and Yoko. After a couple minutes of pain, about 10 minutes or so, Neidhart and Bundy pick up the win. And there we have it. We have the historic heroes of wrestling. I'm going to give this match on a scale of 1 to 5, negative 5,000. And you think it's hyperbole, and you think I'm saying that just to say that, to be glib or to be anti-whatever. I'm not. I've said before in the Volkoff and Sheik versus Bushwhackers matches that belonged in the top 5 of worst matches ever. And I also said in the Snuka versus Orton that belonged in the top 10 of worst matches ever. This match belongs in the top 1 of worst matches ever. I don't think I've ever seen a worse wrestling match with 4 talented guys. Now, I've seen matches that have been worked worse, and I've seen matches that wrestlers weren't as good as these guys, but this match, between the drunkenness of Jake, the overall lack of mobility of Yokozuna, and I hate criticizing him because of what happened so shortly after this. It feels wrong to criticize him here, but I have to, because that's what I'm doing. I'm reviewing the show. Between Neidhart and Bundy, who tried to save it as best they can, 2 consummate professionals, they just couldn't do anything with these 2 guys. It was terrible. It is the worst match I've ever seen. This is probably the 3rd or 4th time I've seen the match itself. First time as part of the entire show, like I said before. I've seen clips from the show before, not the entire thing. I've seen this match before in itself, but it's the worst. It's really, really bad. I don't think that Sharmella and Jenna Morasco could have done anything to touch this, and that's considered the worst match of all time. So, basically looking down at the card, looking over my notes real quick, we have 3 of the 10 worst matches of all time, and probably the worst match of all time. On a 1 to 5 scale, I'm going to give it a negative 5. I can't say enough how bad this was and how disturbing it was to watch Jake the Snake Roberts wrestle in the condition he was, and how, knowing now that Jake is okay, it feels a little bit better. If Jake would have passed away between now and then from his demons, this would have felt worse. Like, it would have made this feel even more disturbing, if you know what I mean. Like, why did they let him go out to the ring like this? Why did they let Yokozuna go out to the ring in the condition he was? I don't know. It makes no sense to me. Overall, a terrible product. It killed off the idea of any more future heroes of wrestling. The fans in attendance were not happy. The pay-per-view buy rate was terrible. I don't believe it ever... I believe it did have a VHS tape that came out, but I don't think there was anything else other than that. Just a terrible, terrible show. Probably the worst show in wrestling that you're able to see that's not bad on purpose. Just terrible. This was a quality... I don't even know. This is like a bad backyard fed quality. Now, I said during the show that I was going to mention what I would have done to make it different. To do it better. Because I don't want to be so negative. We did have some good talent on here. We had some mixes of good wrestlers and some not so good. I would have kept guys like Marty Jannetty and Tommy Rogers on the show. Julio Fantastico, Too Cold Scorpio. Tully Blanchard even. The one-man gang versus Abdullah match, I don't think I would have changed that. I would have kept that on the card. Bundy and Neidhart are fine, so I would have kept them on the card. What I would have done is more of a legends versus indie stars of the time. Or basically, guys that are younger but may have been out of a job at this point. There was a glut of wrestlers that could have been used, so they could have done anything like, to be honest, they could have had like Reckless Youth, who was a big indie star at the time. They could have borrowed some guys from ECW or CZW even, or even XPW had some good wrestlers that could have been used on this show. There's all kinds of things they could have done to make this better. NWA Wildside had a great roster. I believe AJ Styles was already there, Air Paris. Guys like Hurricane Helms were there, Shannon Moore. So they could have done and brought in some guys to make this better. I would have booked it more with young guys versus legends with maybe a main event match. You're going to want probably the two biggest stars on the map of the night are Jake the Snake and Yokozuna. So you may want them on the card. I wouldn't have put Jake or Yoko out in the condition they were. So I may have booked them, but I wouldn't have put them on. I probably would have kept Abby versus One Man Gang, great match. I would maybe made Marty Jannetty versus Tommy Rogers a one-on-one match. Maybe put Julio Fantastico against Tully Blanchard. Too Cold Scorpio. Had him wrestle maybe Neidhart. That might be a good match. A good matchup of the two. Kept Bundy on the show. Bundy wrestling an indie talent. Maybe Reckless Youth or Glenn Osborne or someone of that nature at the time. Who were around. Mike Modest, I believe, was still in the indies at the time. I'm not exactly 100% sure who was available at this booking time, but you get what I'm saying. They could have used a mix of old and new talent, kept some legend matches on there, and made it better. Maybe had some of the other guys come out as special appearances or special ring announcers to pop the fans. A lot of guys I would have left off the card altogether. Volkoff and Sheik, Greg Valentine, George Animal Steele, Jimmy Snuka, Bob Orton. Like I said with Jake and Yoko, both of them I would have left off altogether. So, a lot of guys that weren't even worth putting on there. But, basically, that's my assessment. The worst wrestling show of all time. Thank you, Ryan, for recommending this. I don't hold it against you. I know why you recommended it. You wanted to hear my opinions. And you knew they were going to be bad. And I knew it was going to be a bad show. I'm not angry with you. I actually appreciate, and I like the interaction that you gave, and I do appreciate you recommending it. If anybody else watching this sees this, you can see I'm willing to take recommendations. So if you want to see me review something, leave it down in the comments. I prefer if it be something that's easily accessible, like something I can find on the network or YouTube or Twitch or NWJP World, something that's easily accessible, and I'll review it, whether it be a match, a card, a promo, anything you'd like to see. Let me know. Make sure you pound the like button, pound the subscribe button, share this all around. Basically, that's all I have to say on this one. My name is George Coles, and this is a Heel Heat review of Heroes of Wrestling.